This all a man need to be happy. An empty room, echoing with possibilities. At its heart, there's an air mattress. Not a king-size bed, no fancy linens, just a humble air mattress. It's like a throne, but for the minimalist king, you feel me? Next to it, you got that bottle of Hennessy. No bar, no collection of spirits, just that one bottle. It's a vibe, a symbol. It says, we don't need much, just the right kind of fuel to keep the fire burning. And then, in front of it all, a TV. But wait, it's not about the shows or the movies. Attached to that TV, there's a video game console. That's the escape, the adventure, the battleground. It's where wars are fought, kingdoms are built, and legends are born. Now, some might look at this setup and think, man, that's bare. But that's where they're missing the point. It's not about the material. It's about the essence, the spirit. This room, this setup, it speaks to simplicity, to stripping away the noise, the clutter, and getting back to basics. It's a reminder that happiness isn't about the luxury, the opulence, or the excess. Nah, happiness is about finding contentment in the simple, the genuine, the real. So next time you're chasing that joy, that satisfaction, remember, sometimes all you need is a room, a game, and a bottle to keep the vibes flowing. Stay true to you, find joy in the simple, and always cherish the moments that make life worth living.
There is a quiet shift happening in the world right now, and most people do not want to admit it because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Across cultures, across borders, and across economic systems, a growing number of men are stepping away from traditional dating, relationships, and social expectations altogether. This is not a trend that appeared overnight, and it is not something driven by bitterness or anger alone. It is the result of years of accumulated experiences, changing incentives, and a deep reassessment of what modern relationships actually offer. By the end of this video, you may find yourself questioning narratives that once felt unquestionable, and you may begin to understand why so many men have chosen a different path. Before we get into this, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all so you get every Angry Guy video the moment we release it. If you want to support the channel and make sure this kind of content keeps coming, that small action makes a big difference. I also want to remind you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth, Angry's Crypto Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto with clarity and strategy instead of hype and confusion. Go check it out after this video. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support directly, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. That support helps keep the lights on and the message moving forward. Now let us talk about what is really happening. In many countries today, a growing number of men are opting out of dating and long-term relationships. This is being observed in the United States, across Europe, throughout Asia, and in developing regions as well. The reasons are complex, layered, and deeply personal, but the pattern itself is unmistakable. Men are approaching less, initiating less, and disengaging more. This is not because men suddenly lost interest in companionship or connection. It is because many have concluded that the cost to reward ratio no longer makes sense for them. For decades, men were told that their value came from what they provided. Stability, protection, resources, emotional strength, and leadership were expected, while their needs were often minimized or dismissed. At the same time, cultural narratives increasingly framed men as disposable, replaceable, or inherently problematic. Over time, that messaging had consequences. When you repeatedly tell a group of people they are not needed, that they are dangerous, or that their natural tendencies are wrong, some of them will eventually believe you. Others will quietly leave. Many men today are choosing solitude not out of resentment, but out of calculation. They looked at their own lives, their stress levels, their finances, their mental health, and their long-term goals, and they asked a simple question. Does this arrangement improve my life or complicate it? For a growing number of men, the honest answer was that it complicates it. At the same time, there is a parallel realization happening among many women, particularly those who follow the dominant cultural script of delaying relationships indefinitely in favor of short-term fulfillment or external validation. As time passes, expectations collide with reality. Biological timelines, shifting social dynamics, and changing priorities create pressure that cannot be ignored forever. This is not about blame or mockery, it is about cause and effect. A generation was told that time was unlimited, that consequences were optional, and that every door would remain open forever. That message was comforting, but it was incomplete. Time is not infinite, choices compound, and paths not taken do eventually close. Social media has amplified this realization. Platforms are now filled with honest, emotional conversations about loneliness, regret, confusion, and fear about the future. Some of these voices come from men who feel burned out and disconnected. Others come from women who are questioning whether the promises they were given actually aligned with reality. What we are witnessing is not a battle between genders, but a collision between ideology and lived experience. For men who have stepped away, something unexpected happened once they let go of the chase. Their stress decreased, their finances stabilized, their routines became simpler. Many discovered that being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. When a man builds a life that aligns with his values, filled with purpose, structure, and autonomy, he often finds peace in ways that constant external validation never provided. Minimalism plays a role here. Men by nature often thrive when life is streamlined. Fewer obligations, fewer emotional landmines, fewer financial drains, and fewer unspoken expectations create space for focus and growth. This does not mean men no longer value relationships. It means they are no longer willing to enter them blindly or at any cost. One of the most profound shifts is that many men have stopped believing words alone. Instead, they observe patterns, they trust actions, they pay attention to incentives. When messages and outcomes do not align, they adjust accordingly. This is not cynicism, it is adaptation. For years, men were told to approach less, speak less, and risk less. They were told to be cautious, to seek consent for everything, and to assume guilt until proven otherwise. Eventually, many decided that the safest move was not to play at all. When participation becomes liability, withdrawal becomes logical. What we are seeing now is the downstream effect of decades of messaging that framed independence as empowerment without acknowledging interdependence. Societies function when both men and women feel valued, respected, and fairly treated. When that balance is disrupted, participation declines. Women are now experiencing what it feels like when attention, effort, and provision are no longer automatic, when support must be negotiated instead of assumed. This is not punishment, it is adjustment. Systems change when incentives change. Men who have walked away often report improved health, better sleep, stronger friendships, and a renewed sense of control over their lives. They invest in skills, hobbies, travel, fitness, and financial security. Many are not bitter, they are simply done compromising themselves for outcomes that no longer justify the sacrifice. This does not mean relationships are doomed or that connection is impossible. It means the old scripts no longer work. The expectations on both sides must evolve. Respect must be mutual. Accountability must be shared. And reality must replace fantasy. As economies tighten and life becomes more expensive, practical considerations matter more than ever. Men are increasingly aware that they are not obligated to absorb unlimited risk for diminishing returns. They are prioritizing self preservation, stability, and peace. What makes this moment uncomfortable is that it exposes uncomfortable truths, that not all advice was helpful, that not all progress was balanced, and that ignoring human nature does not erase it. Men did not disappear overnight. They responded to incentives, they adapted to conditions, They made choices based on experience rather than ideology. And once a man learns that he can build a fulfilling life without constant conflict, he rarely rushes back into chaos. As more men step off the treadmill, the silence becomes louder. Fewer approaches, fewer dates, fewer traditional milestones. This is not a conspiracy, it is arithmetic. Society is now at a crossroads. It can double down on narratives that no longer match reality, or it can have honest conversations about expectations, roles, and mutual benefit. The path forward requires humility, empathy, and accountability from everyone involved. The men who have chosen this path are not asking for validation, they are not demanding change. They are simply living differently. And that, more than any protest or slogan, is what is reshaping the landscape. And this is only the beginning of the conversation. As this shift unfolds, it becomes impossible to ignore how deeply it affects every layer of society. Workplaces, housing markets, consumer behavior, and even entertainment reflect the choices people make in their private lives. When large numbers of men disengage from traditional relationship paths, spending patterns change. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. Risk tolerance changes. Long-term planning changes. Men who once structured their lives around providing for a household now structure their lives around sustainability and autonomy. This alters how they save, where they live, how they invest, and what they prioritize. These are not emotional reactions. These are rational responses to the environment they find themselves in. For decades, many men were told that fulfillment came from external approval. That success meant being chosen, being desired, being validated. But what happens when validation becomes conditional, inconsistent, or transactional? Eventually, people stop seeking it. Men begin to ask whether they are chasing something real or something manufactured. When the answer is unclear, withdrawal becomes a form of self respect rather than defeat. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this movement is that it is not rooted in hatred or hostility. Most men who step away do not spend their time angry or resentful. They are not sitting around complaining. In fact, many report feeling calmer and more centered than they ever did before. When a man removes constant tension from his life, he gains mental bandwidth. That bandwidth often gets redirected toward growth, creativity, and long term security. Men rediscover old interests they abandoned in the pursuit of approval. Reading, building, learning, training, traveling, and creating become sources of fulfillment again. Friendships deepen because they are no longer neglected. Time becomes an asset instead of a liability. When a man realizes that peace is possible without constant compromise, his standards change permanently. At the same time, society struggles to interpret what is happening. Some label it a crisis, others dismiss it as a phase. But patterns this widespread do not emerge randomly. They are signals. They indicate misalignment between expectations and outcomes. When participation drops, it is usually because the system no longer serves those within it. This raises difficult questions about accountability. For years, responsibility was framed as one sided. Men were told to improve, adapt, apologize, and change endlessly. Self reflection was demanded of them constantly. Meanwhile, criticism of broader cultural narratives was discouraged. When one side is expected to carry all responsibility, imbalance is inevitable. Men eventually noticed that no amount of self improvement guaranteed fairness or stability. No amount of patience ensured reciprocity. No amount of compliance protected them from risk. Once that realization sets in, behavior changes. Men stop volunteering for roles that expose them to disproportionate consequences. There is also a generational component to this shift. Younger men grew up watching the experiences of older men. They observed divorces, financial losses, emotional burnout, and public shaming. They learn not from theory, but from observation. Pattern recognition is powerful. When enough examples point in the same direction, people adapt preemptively. Technology accelerated this process. The internet allows men to share experiences openly and anonymously. Stories that were once isolated are now visible. This does not create the problem, it reveals it. When people realize they are not alone, they stop internalizing blame for systemic issues. Another important factor is economics. The cost of living has risen sharply in many parts of the world. Housing, education, healthcare, and basic necessities demand more resources than ever before. In this environment, men become more protective of their time and money. They are less willing to invest heavily in arrangements that offer uncertainty rather than security. When survival becomes more complex, priorities sharpen. Men ask practical questions. What does this relationship add to my life? What risks does it introduce? What obligations does it create? These questions are not romantic, but they are realistic. Romance does not pay bills or resolve conflicts. Stability does. Men are also increasingly aware that they cannot outsource happiness. For years, happiness was framed as something to be found in another person. But that model fails when the other person becomes the primary source of stress. Men learn that inner stability must come first. Without it, no relationship can function sustainably. This internal shift leads to a quieter, more deliberate lifestyle. Men spend less time trying to impress and more time trying to improve. They invest in health because energy matters. They invest in skills because competence matters. They invest in assets because independence matters. These investments compound over time. Critics often misunderstand this as selfishness. In reality, it is self stewardship. You cannot pour endlessly from an empty cup. Men who neglected themselves for years are finally reclaiming balance. That does not make them cold, it makes them grounded. On the other side, many women are navigating unfamiliar territory. A tension that once felt abundant now feels scarce. Expectations that once felt guaranteed now require effort. This adjustment can be unsettling. It forces introspection. It challenges assumptions about leverage and value. Again, this is not about blame, it is about recalibration. When dynamics change, everyone must adapt. The old rules no longer apply because the environment has changed. Nostalgia for the past does not rebuild participation. Only alignment does. And one of the most striking outcomes of this shift is that men are no longer motivated by guilt. For years, guilt was used as a tool to drive compliance. Men were told they owed society, owed relationships, owed participation. Over time, that messaging lost its power. Guilt does not sustain long term engagement, only mutual benefit does. Men who walk away often describe a sense of relief, not because they hate connection, but because they are no longer forcing themselves into roles that do not fit. When pressure disappears, clarity emerges. Men begin to see themselves not as utilities, but as individuals with agency. This agency changes everything. When a man realizes he has the right to say no, his yes becomes meaningful. He is no longer negotiating from fear, but from choice. That shift is subtle, but transformative. As more men adopt this mindset, the dating landscape continues to evolve. Fewer cold approaches, more guarded interactions, more emphasis on boundaries and clarity. Men are no longer rushing. They are observing, they are selective, they are intentional. This selectivity is often misinterpreted as apathy. In reality, it is discernment. Men are not uninterested in connection. They are uninterested in chaos. They are not avoiding relationships. They are avoiding imbalance. The broader cultural conversation struggles to catch up because it relies on outdated assumptions. It assumes men will always chase. It assumes men will always adapt. It assumes men will always absorb risk. When those assumptions fail, confusion follows, and institutions built on those assumptions begin to wobble. Media narratives feel disconnected from lived experience. Advice that once sounded empowering now sounds hollow. People begin to question who benefited from certain narratives and at what cost. Men asking questions is not a threat, it is a sign of maturity. A society that discourages questions cannot correct itself. Progress requires feedback. Walking away, what's in this context, is feedback. Some men may eventually return to relationships, but they will not return to the same terms. They will demand reciprocity. They will demand respect. They will demand peace. Without those conditions, participation remains optional. This reality is uncomfortable for those who relied on default engagement, but discomfort often precedes growth. Systems either evolve or lose relevance. Relationships are no different. As this movement continues, it becomes less about protest and more about lifestyle. Men are not organizing marches, they are organizing their lives quietly, deliberately, permanently. The most powerful statement a man can make is not an argument, it is a choice. And choices, when made at scale, reshape the world. We are living through that reshaping now. As this reshaping accelerates, something subtle but important becomes clear. The absence of men from certain spaces creates a vacuum, and vacuums reveal truth. When effort disappears, its former value becomes visible. When attention is withdrawn, its former weight becomes obvious. For a long time, male participation was treated as a constant, something that could be relied upon without maintenance. But constants only exist in theory. In real life, everything responds to pressure. Men stepping back has exposed how many systems quietly depended on their unspoken labor. Emotional labor, financial labor, physical labor, decision making, crisis management. For years, much of this work was invisible precisely because it was expected. Once it stopped, the silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. Many men report that when they withdrew, nobody asked how they were doing. Nobody asked what drove their decision. Instead, assumptions were made, labels were applied, motives were assigned. That response only reinforced their choice. When someone leaves quietly and is met with dismissal rather than curiosity, it confirms that their presence was taken for granted. This is where the conversation often goes wrong. Instead of asking why men are disengaging, much of society focuses on how to pull them back in without changing the conditions that drove them away. That approach does not work. You cannot rebuild trust by ignoring the reasons it was lost. You cannot restore participation by pretending nothing happened. Trust is built when incentives align and when boundaries are respected. Men who have stepped away are not hostile to connection. They are cautious. They have learned that words and outcomes do not always match. They have learned that promises can dissolve under pressure. They have learned that protection is rarely reciprocal. One of the most overlooked elements of the shift is how it affects male identity. For generations, men were socialized to derive purpose from duty. You provide, you endure, you sacrifice, you keep going. That framework works only when sacrifice leads somewhere meaningful. When sacrifice becomes endless and unacknowledged, identity fractures. Men who walk away often rebuild their sense of self from the inside out. Instead of asking what is expected of me, they ask, what do I want my life to look like? That question changes everything. It removes external control and replaces it with intentional design. This redesign often starts small. Better sleep, consistent routines, cleaner living spaces, physical training, skill development, These may sound basic, but they are foundational. Stability begins with order. Order begins with personal responsibility that is chosen, not imposed. As men stabilize themselves, they become less reactive. Drama loses its pull. Provocation loses its power. Validation loses its grip. When a man no longer needs approval to feel complete, manipulation stops working. This is why so many narratives fail to resonate with men who have already stepped away. Those narratives rely on guilt, fear, or obligation. All three lose effectiveness when self respect is restored. Another important aspect is how men view time. Time becomes precious once you stop giving it away automatically. Men begin to notice how much energy certain interactions drain and how little they return. That awareness leads to selectivity. Selectivity leads to peace. Peace, however, is often misunderstood. It is not passivity, it is not apathy, it is clarity. Peace allows men to act decisively when action is required and to disengage when it is not. It replaces chaos with intention. As more men adopt this mindset, cultural friction increases. Societies accustomed to male compliance struggle to adapt to male autonomy. When men stop absorbing pressure, that pressure has to go somewhere else. That redistribution is uncomfortable. It forces conversations that were long overdue. There is also a misconception that men who walk away are isolated or disconnected. In reality, many form stronger bonds with other men. Brotherhood becomes important again. Shared values, mutual respect, honest conversations. These relationships are often grounded in reality rather than performance. There is less posturing and more presence. Men support each other differently. They do not always talk about feelings directly, but they build through action, training together, working together, creating together. These shared efforts create trust without theatrics. That trust becomes a stabilizing force. As men invest more in themselves and their communities, their tolerance for unnecessary conflict drops. They become less interested in arguments that go nowhere, less interested in proving points to people who are not listening. Silence becomes a tool rather than a weakness. This silence unsettles people who relied on constant engagement. When men stop responding, narratives lose fuel. When men stop reacting, outrage cycles lose momentum. Withdrawal becomes a form of boundary enforcement. It is important to understand that walking away does not mean disappearing from society. Men still work, they still contribute, they still innovate, they still build. They simply do so on their own terms. They choose where to invest and where not to. This choice based participation changes the power dynamics of relationships. Men are no longer negotiating from scarcity, they are negotiating from abundance of self. That shift raises standards naturally. When you are content alone, companionship must enhance your life rather than disrupt it. For some women, this creates an opportunity for growth. Mutual respect becomes attractive again. Cooperation replaces entitlement. Communication becomes clearer. For others, the adjustment is more difficult. Expectations formed under old conditions clash with new realities. Again, this is not about winners and losers. It is about alignment. Relationships that adapt will survive. Those that do not will fade. Another layer of the shift involves accountability in narratives. For a long time, complex social outcomes were explained through simplistic blame. Men were told they were the problem, full stop. Over time, that explanation lost credibility. Reality is rarely one sided. Men walking away is not a rejection of responsibility, it is a rejection of asymmetrical responsibility. Men are willing to contribute, they are unwilling to be exploited. Exploitation does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like unending expectation, without appreciation. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice without security. Sometimes it looks like effort without influence. Over time, even subtle imbalances erode goodwill. Men noticed that when they set boundaries, they were often punished. When they expressed needs, they were often dismissed. When they prioritized themselves, they were often shamed. Those patterns teach lessons. The lesson many men learned was to stop negotiating altogether. As this behavior spreads, it influences younger generations even more strongly. Younger men are growing up with access to information previous generations never had. They see outcomes in real time. They hear stories without filters. They are not relying on idealized narratives. They are learning from observation. This does not make them cynical, it makes them pragmatic. They are not anti relationship, they are pro clarity. They want to know the rules before they play. They want to know the risks before they invest. When clarity is missing, abstention becomes rational. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail. Shame only works when someone believes they are wrong. Men who have already evaluated the system and opted out do not share that belief. To them, withdrawal is not failure, it is optimization. As men optimize their lives, they often experience a sense of quiet confidence, not arrogance, confidence rooted in competence and self trust. They know they can survive alone. That knowledge removes desperation from their decisions. Desperation is what leads people into bad arrangements. When desperation disappears, discernment takes its place. Discernment leads to fewer choices, but better ones. This is why men who walk away often say that even if they never return to traditional relationships, they are at peace with that outcome. Peace is not something you give up lightly once you have it. The broader culture may resist this shift, but resistance does not reverse reality. The only path forward is adaptation. That adaptation requires honesty, empathy, and accountability on all sides. Men are not asking to be worshiped. They are asking to be respected. They are not asking to dominate. They are asking for balance. They are not asking to return to the past. They are asking for a future that makes sense. As more men choose this path, society will continue to feel the effects. Some systems will adjust, others will break. That is how change always unfolds. The quiet part is that many men are happier now than they have been in years, not because they escaped responsibility, but because they reclaimed authorship over their lives. And once a man becomes the author of his own story, he's very careful about which characters he allows into it. As this evolution continues, one of the most revealing changes is how men now evaluate meaning itself. For a long time, meaning was outsourced. Men were taught that purpose would arrive after achievement, after approval, after recognition from others. That framework collapses when approval becomes unstable or conditional. Men who step away are forced to confront a deeper question, which is what actually gives my life value when nobody is watching and nobody is applauding. That question is uncomfortable at first, but it is also liberating. When meaning is rebuilt internally, it becomes resilient. It no longer depends on trends, opinions, or social validation. Men begin to understand that peace is not something granted by society, but something constructed through alignment between values and actions. This realization fundamentally alters how they move through the world. They stop performing, they stop posturing, they stop negotiating their identity. Instead, they operate quietly, deliberately, and with intention. That internal shift is why attempts to lure men back into old dynamics with surface level incentives fail. Once a man has tasted self authored meaning, superficial rewards lose their appeal. Another critical layer of this transformation is how men reinterpret strength. Strength is no longer defined solely by endurance or sacrifice. It is defined by discernment. Knowing when to engage and when to disengage becomes a skill rather than a weakness. Men learn that saying no is often more powerful than saying yes. They learn that restraint can be a form of strength equal to action. This reframing challenges outdated ideas about masculinity that equated worth with suffering. Men who walk away are not running from responsibility. They are choosing responsibility that actually leads somewhere. They become careful stewards of their energy because they understand that energy is finite. Every commitment has a cost. Every obligation extracts something. When men stop giving their energy away indiscriminately, they regain clarity. That clarity sharpens decision making and reduces regret. Instead of reacting emotionally, men respond strategically. Instead of chasing outcomes, they build foundations. Over time, this creates a sense of stability that many had never experienced before. This stability changes how men relate to uncertainty. In the past, uncertainty was often masked by distraction or denial. Relationships were sometimes used to avoid confronting deeper anxieties about direction, purpose, or mortality. When men step away from constant external engagement, they are forced to sit with themselves. That process can be difficult, but it is also transformative. Men confront fears they had postponed. They process losses they had buried. They reassess dreams they had inherited rather than chosen. This inner work is rarely visible, but it is profound. It reshapes priorities. It clarifies what matters and what does not. Men emerge from this process less reactive and more grounded. They are no longer easily pulled into conflicts that do not serve their long term well being. They develop patience not as passivity, but as confidence in their ability to wait for what aligns. As men change internally, their external behavior shifts naturally. They speak less, but with more precision. They promise less, but follow through more consistently. They become harder to provoke because their sense of self is no longer fragile. This frustrates systems and narratives that rely on emotional manipulation. When outrage no longer produces engagement, it loses power. When guilt no longer produces compliance, it fades. Men walking away inadvertently expose how much of modern discourse depends on constant reaction. Silence in this context becomes disruptive. It forces others to confront the absence rather than the argument. It removes the familiar dance of accusation and defense. That absence is uncomfortable because it cannot be controlled or redirected. Another consequence of this shift is the redefinition of success. Men begin to measure success less by external milestones and more by internal coherence. Are my actions consistent with my values? Does my daily life reflect what I claim to care about? Am I at peace with how I spend my time? These questions replace older metrics that emphasized status, conquest, or validation. Success becomes quieter, more personal, and less performative. Men may still pursue achievement, but they do so without attaching their identity to outcomes beyond their control. This detachment does not reduce ambition, it refines it. Men focus on mastery rather than applause. They invest in processes rather than appearances. Over time, this produces competence that does not need to announce itself. The ripple effects of this mindset extend into every area of life. Work becomes a tool rather than an identity. Men choose careers that support their desired lifestyle rather than lifestyles that serve their careers. Financial decisions become more conservative, more strategic, and more future oriented. Men prioritize liquidity, flexibility, and resilience. They avoid unnecessary debt. They plan for uncertainty rather than assuming stability. This pragmatic approach is not driven by fear, but by realism. Men understand that the world is volatile and that personal stability requires preparation. By reducing dependency on external systems and volatile relationships, they increase their autonomy. Socially, men become more selective about who they allow into their inner circle. They value honesty over flattery, consistency over charisma, reliability over excitement. This selectivity reduces drama and increases trust. Men are no longer interested in managing emotions that are not their responsibility. They support others, but they do not enable dysfunction. This boundary setting is often misunderstood as coldness, but it is actually clarity. Clear boundaries create healthier interactions. They prevent resentment from building. They allow generosity to be genuine rather than coerced. As these changes accumulate, men begin to notice something unexpected. Their lives feel lighter, not empty, but lighter. The constant background stress that once accompanied relationships, expectations, and social pressure diminishes. Men sleep better. They think more clearly. They feel more present. This improved baseline makes it even less appealing to return to environments that disrupt their equilibrium. Peace becomes addictive in the best possible way. Once experienced, it becomes non negotiable. From the outside, this transformation can look like withdrawal. In reality, it is consolidation. Men are not shrinking their lives, they are refining them. They are removing what does not serve them and strengthening what does. This refinement is intentional. It reflects maturity rather than avoidance. Men are not rejecting connection, they are rejecting noise. They are not rejecting responsibility, they are rejecting imbalance. This distinction is critical, yet often ignored by critics who view disengagement through a moral lens rather than a practical one. Culturally, this creates tension because many narratives were built on the assumption of male availability. When that availability disappears, those narratives struggle to adapt. Advice that once assumed men would always show up now sounds disconnected. Expectations that relied on default participation now require negotiation. This transition is awkward, but necessary. Systems that cannot adapt to changing conditions eventually lose relevance. Relationships are systems, so are cultural norms. Both must evolve or stagnate. The long term implications of the shift are still unfolding. Some outcomes will be positive, others will be challenging. But what is clear is that men are no longer willing to be silent participants in arrangements that do not respect their humanity. They are no longer willing to sacrifice themselves for abstract ideals that offer no tangible return. They are choosing lives that make sense to them, even if those lives do not fit traditional expectations. And this choice is not made lightly. It often comes after disappointment, confusion, and introspection. Men do not walk away impulsively. They walk away after concluding that staying costs too much. That conclusion is personal, but the pattern is collective. When millions of individuals independently reach similar conclusions, it signals a structural issue rather than a personal failing. What happens next depends on whether society is willing to listen without defensiveness. Its change requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths. It requires moving beyond slogans and examining incentives. It requires recognizing that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned and maintained. Men have shown that they are willing to disengage when respect is absent. That is not a threat, it is information. As more men choose this path, the conversation will continue to evolve. Some will misunderstand it, some will resist it, some will adapt to it, but it will not reverse through denial. The only sustainable response is balance. Balance between expectation and reward. Balance between contribution and appreciation. Balance between autonomy and connection. Men walking away are not asking permission. They are exercising choice. That choice is reshaping norms quietly and persistently. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is steady. And steady change is often the most enduring kind. As this quiet transformation deepens, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore, which is how men now relate to expectations placed upon them by society at large. Expectations once functioned like invisible contracts. Men were expected to provide, to endure, to protect, to fix, and to absorb consequences without complaint. These expectations were rarely negotiated and often enforced through shame rather than consent. Over time, men began to question why these obligations existed and who truly benefited from them. When those questions went unanswered or were dismissed outright, disengagement became the only remaining form of agency. Men did not revolt, they recalibrated, they stopped assuming responsibility for outcomes they did not control. This shift fundamentally alters how obligation itself is perceived. Obligation without reciprocity is no longer viewed as noble, it is viewed as unsustainable. Once men internalize this distinction, they stop volunteering for roles that demand endless output with diminishing respect. This does not make them irresponsible, it makes them strategic. That strategic mindset carries into how men now approach trust. Trust used to be extended automatically, especially in intimate or social contexts. Men were encouraged to be open, vulnerable, and accommodating, often without parallel assurances of safety or fairness. Over time, repeated breaches of trust taught a different lesson. Trust, like time, became something to be earned rather than assumed. Men who walk away do not lack trust. They apply it selectively, they observe consistency over time, they evaluate behavior rather than rhetoric. This discernment protects them from emotional whiplash and long term regret. It also slows everything down. Relationships unfold more deliberately or not at all. That pace frustrates those accustomed to immediate access, but it reflects a recalibration of risk rather than fear. Another overlooked aspect of the shift is how men process failure. In the past, failed relationships were often framed as personal shortcomings. Men were encouraged to internalize blame and to fix themselves endlessly. While self reflection has value, endless self correction without reciprocal accountability becomes corrosive. Men eventually recognize that not every failure is internal. Some failures are systemic, some are mismatches, some are the result of incentives that reward short term behavior over long term stability. Recognizing this distinction frees men from perpetual self doubt. They stop pathologizing themselves for outcomes shaped by factors beyond their control. This mental shift restores confidence without arrogance. Men begin to trust their judgment again. With that restored self trust comes a reevaluation of compromise. Compromise was once presented as the hallmark of maturity. Give a little, bend a little, adjust a little, but compromise only works when it is mutual. When compromise flows in one direction, it becomes self erasure. Men who walk away often do so after realizing that their compromises were cumulative, while concessions in return were minimal or symbolic. This imbalance erodes respect and intimacy simultaneously. By stepping away, men reclaim the right to negotiate rather than concede. They learn that compatibility cannot be forced through sacrifice alone. It must be built through alignment. As men disengage from performative roles, they also disengage from performative emotions. They no longer feel compelled to signal virtue, compliance, or outrage on cue. Emotional regulation becomes internal rather than reactive. Men stop broadcasting their inner state for validation. Instead, they process privately and act deliberately. This emotional self sufficiency is often misread as emotional absence. In reality, it is emotional maturity. Men still feel deeply, but they no longer outsource their emotional regulation to external feedback loops. This makes them more stable partners and more stable individuals, even if they choose solitude. Over time, this internal restructuring reshapes how men view companionship. Companionship is no longer treated as a cure for dissatisfaction. It is treated as an enhancement to an already functional life. This distinction changes everything. When companionship is optional rather than essential, desperation disappears. Without desperation, power dynamics equalize. Men no longer tolerate disrespect in exchange for proximity. They no longer accept instability in exchange for validation. Companionship must earn its place through contribution, not assumption. This mindset also alters how men view conflict. Conflict used to be something to manage, absorb, or resolve at personal cost. Now, conflict is evaluated for necessity. Is this disagreement productive? Does it lead to growth? Or is it cyclical and draining? Men increasingly choose disengagement over endless negotiation. This is not avoidance, it is prioritization. Men recognize that not every conflict deserves their energy. Some conflicts persist precisely because attention sustains them. By withdrawing attention, men deprive these conflicts of oxygen, and the cumulative effect of these choices is a quieter life. Quieter does not mean empty, it means intentional. Men fill their days with routines that support their health, finances, and long term vision. They build habits that compound positively. Training, learning, creating, and maintaining order become daily anchors. These anchors provide stability that external validation never could. When life feels anchored, chaos loses its allure. This stability also changes how men perceive loneliness. Loneliness was once framed as a failure state, something to be avoided at all costs. But many men discover that solitude is not inherently painful. What was painful was unchosen isolation paired with longing. Chosen solitude paired with purpose feels entirely different. Men learn to enjoy their own company. They learn to sit with their thoughts without distraction. This capacity for solitude strengthens identity. A man who can be alone without discomfort is difficult to manipulate through fear of abandonment. As this becomes more common, cultural assumptions about male motivation begin to crumble. The idea that men will always pursue, always provide, always initiate loses accuracy. Motivation shifts from obligation to alignment. Men act when something resonates with their values. They disengage when it does not. This selective engagement reshapes social norms slowly but decisively. Institutions that relied on male compliance face the greatest challenge. When men stop overextending themselves, gaps appear. These gaps force reevaluation. Who is responsible? Who benefits? Who decides? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Progress requires honesty about incentives and outcomes. Men stepping back are not sabotaging systems. They are revealing where systems depended on silent sacrifice rather than sustainable design. This revelation creates resistance because it disrupts narratives of inevitability. What was once assumed to be natural is revealed to be contingent. When participation becomes optional, systems must offer value rather than rely on pressure. This is true in relationships, workplaces, and communities alike. Men walking away are not demanding change, they are creating conditions that make change unavoidable. On an individual level, men often report that their sense of dignity improves as they disengage from roles that conflicted with their values. Dignity comes from coherence between belief and behavior. When men stop acting against their own interests out of obligation, that coherence is restored. They feel less fragmented, less conflicted, more whole. This internal alignment radiates outward. Others sense it, some respect it, some resent it, but it is undeniable. As more men embody this alignment, a new archetype emerges. Not the conqueror, not the provider, not the rebel, but the self governed man, a man who chooses his commitments carefully, who honors his boundaries without apology, who contributes where he is valued and withdraws where he is not. This archetype is quiet, but it is resilient. It does not seek approval. It does not require consensus. It operates independently of trends. This independence is often misunderstood as disengagement from society. In reality, it is disengagement from dysfunction. Men still care about outcomes. They still care about fairness. They still care about legacy. They simply refuse to sacrifice themselves for narratives that no longer align with reality. They choose to invest where effort leads to growth rather than erosion. And as this pattern spreads, it becomes increasingly clear that the conversation is not about men versus women, tradition versus progress, or past versus future. It is about alignment versus denial. Systems that adapt will survive. Systems that rely on coercion will decay. Men walking away are not accelerating collapse. They are responding to imbalance. The future will likely include new forms of partnership, new social contracts, and new expectations on all sides. These will not be built through shame or nostalgia. They will be built through mutual benefit and clear boundaries. Men have signaled that they are open to connection under those conditions. Until then, they are content building lives that stand on their own. That contentment is the most disruptive force of all. A man who is content cannot be easily controlled. He cannot be easily provoked. He cannot be easily guilted. He acts from choice rather than fear. And when millions of men act from choice, the world changes, not through noise, but through absence. As this absence becomes more visible, society begins to encounter a paradox it was not prepared for. Men were long described as privileged, overrepresented, and overly influential, yet many systems quietly relied on their participation to function smoothly. When men disengage, those systems do not simply rebalance on their own, they strain. The contradiction exposes an uncomfortable truth, which is that power and responsibility were often conflated, and burden was mistaken for privilege. Men were expected to shoulder risk, accountability, and consequence while being told their contributions were unremarkable or even harmful. Once men internalize that contradiction, many choose to step back rather than continue carrying roles that come with blame but little respect. This is not a protest, it is a refusal to accept a narrative that does not match lived experience. As men step back, conversations about fairness begin to surface in places they were previously avoided. Fairness is no longer framed only in terms of outcomes, but in terms of exposure to risk. Men notice that they were often expected to absorb the consequences of failure while receiving limited protection from those same systems when things went wrong. Over time, this realization reshapes how men assess commitment. Commitment is no longer about proving worth, it is about negotiating risk. Men ask who benefits if this succeeds and who pays if it fails. These are practical questions, not ideological ones. When answers are unclear or one sided, commitment declines. This risk awareness changes how men relate to institutions as well. Workplaces, legal frameworks, and social norms are evaluated through a lens of incentive and consequence. Men become less willing to sacrifice long term stability for short term approval. They choose safer paths, even if those paths are less celebrated. They avoid visibility that comes with disproportionate scrutiny. They prefer predictability over prestige. This shift does not indicate a lack of ambition, it indicates a recalibration of priorities. Men are optimizing for sustainability rather than recognition. Another profound change is how men now understand freedom. Freedom was once framed as access, choice, and indulgence, but many men discover that true freedom comes from constraint chosen deliberately, routine, discipline, structure. These constraints reduce cognitive load and emotional volatility. They create space for focus. Men who build disciplined lives find that they have more freedom, not less. They are less reactive to external pressures. They are less dependent on others for validation or direction. This self imposed structure replaces the chaos that often accompanied unstructured pursuit of approval. As men adopt this disciplined approach, they become more resilient to social pressure. Trends lose their influence. Popular opinion loses its grip. Men stop measuring themselves against shifting standards. Instead, they measure themselves against personal benchmarks. Did I act with integrity today? Did I move closer to my goals? Did I maintain my standards? These internal metrics provide stability in a volatile environment. They also make men less susceptible to manipulation through fear of exclusion or ridicule. This resilience is often mistaken for indifference, but indifference implies lack of care. What men experience is selective care. They care deeply about what aligns with their values and very little about what does not. This selectivity conserves energy and reduces burnout. Men no longer feel compelled to engage in debates that go nowhere or to defend positions that were never chosen consciously. Silence becomes a boundary. Absence becomes a statement. As this pattern spreads, the social landscape shifts. Fewer men participate in performative rituals of dating, courtship, and public validation. The spectacle loses participants. Without participants, it loses relevance. This forces a reevaluation of what connection actually means when stripped of performance. Authenticity becomes harder to fake. Intentions become clearer when effort is no longer guaranteed. For men who remain open to partnership, standards rise naturally. Compatibility is assessed across values, communication styles, and long term vision rather than surface level attraction alone. Men are no longer willing to gamble years of their lives on uncertainty. They prefer clarity early. This preference shortens many interactions, but it also prevents deeper misalignment later. Efficiency replaces endurance. This efficiency extends to emotional labor as well. Men stop acting as emotional shock absorbers. They stop mediating conflicts they did not create. They stop managing feelings they are not responsible for. This does not make them unkind. It makes them accountable only for their own behavior. Healthy relationships require shared responsibility for emotional regulation. Men who walk away have learned this through experience rather than theory. As men reclaim this boundary, they often discover a deeper sense of self respect. Self respect is not arrogance, it is alignment. It is the confidence that comes from honoring one's own limits. Men who respect themselves do not need to dominate or control others. They simply remove themselves from situations that violate their standards. This quiet exit is often more powerful than confrontation because it denies dysfunctional dynamics the engagement they rely on. This denial of engagement has broader consequences. Narratives that depended on male reaction lose traction. Media cycles that thrived on outrage struggle to maintain a tangent. When men stop responding predictably, messaging loses effectiveness. This does not mean men are disengaged from reality. It means they are no longer predictable inputs in systems designed to provoke response, and the unpredictability unsettles those who benefited from consistency. When men always showed up, always paid, always initiated, always absorbed, systems could be designed around that reliability. When that reliability disappears, adaptation becomes necessary. Adaptation requires humility. It requires acknowledging that previous assumptions were flawed. This is often the hardest step. On a psychological level, men who walk away report a growing sense of agency. Agency is the belief that one's actions matter and that one has control over outcomes. When men feel trapped in roles they did not choose, agency erodes. When they reclaim choice, agency returns. This restoration of agency improves mental health more effectively than external affirmation ever could. Men feel grounded, they feel capable, they feel responsible for their lives in a way that is empowering rather than burdensome. This empowerment changes how men relate to uncertainty about the future. Instead of fearing it, they prepare for it. They build buffers, financial reserves, transferable skills, physical health, emotional resilience. These buffers reduce anxiety and increase confidence. Men who are prepared are less desperate. Men who are less desperate are less likely to enter unfavorable arrangements. And as desperation declines, leverage equalizes. Relationships become negotiations rather than rescues. Men are no longer seeking someone to complete them, they are seeking someone to complement them. This distinction is subtle but transformative. Complementarity requires mutual contribution. Completion implies deficiency. Men reject the latter framework entirely. Culturally, this rejection forces a reevaluation of long held narratives about masculinity and worth. Men are no longer defined solely by what they give to others, they define themselves by how they live. This self definition reduces susceptibility to shame. Shame requires internal agreement. When men no longer accept the premise that their worth depends on endless giving, shame loses its grip. As shame loses power, authenticity increases. Men speak less in public, but more honestly in private. Conversations with trusted peers become deeper. Vulnerability becomes selective rather than performative. Men share struggles with those who have earned their trust, not with audiences seeking spectacle. This selective vulnerability builds stronger bonds and reduces exploitation. Over time, these changes create a new baseline for male participation in society. Men are present but not overextended, engaged but not obligated, willing but not compelled. This baseline is healthier for men and ultimately healthier for society, even if the transition is uncomfortable. The discomfort arises because the old equilibrium depended on asymmetry. Removing asymmetry requires redesign. Redesign is disruptive, but disruption is preferable to decay. Men walking away are not causing collapse, they are signaling the need for reform. The path forward will not be found in shaming men back into old roles. It will be found in creating environments where participation is rewarding, respectful, and sustainable. Men have shown that they are willing to engage under those conditions. Until then, they will continue building lives that function independently. And this independence is not isolation, it is self sufficiency. Self sufficient men can choose connection freely rather than out of necessity. That freedom is the foundation of genuine partnership, should it arise. As this reality becomes clearer, the conversation will inevitably shift from why are men leaving to what would make staying worthwhile. That is the only question that matters. And the answer will not come from ideology, it will come from lived experience, mutual accountability, and respect that flows both ways. As this long arc reaches its final stage, the most important realization is not about conflict, blame, or grievance, but about adaptation. Societies change when incentives change, and individuals adapt when old strategies stop producing stability. Men did not arrive at this point suddenly, nor did they do so collectively by agreement. They arrived here through experience, through observation, through trial and error, through years of being told one thing while living another. What we are witnessing is not rebellion, but recalibration. Men adjusted their behavior to align with reality rather than rhetoric, and that alignment has reshaped their priorities at a fundamental level. What makes this shift so difficult for many to process is that it does not come with dramatic gestures. There are no mass protests, no unified slogans, no central leaders. Instead, there is quiet withdrawal, a slow reduction in participation, a noticeable absence where effort once existed. That absence is often interpreted as apathy, but it is better understood as discernment. Men did not stop caring about life, meaning, or contribution. They stopped caring about systems and dynamics that did not return what they demanded. That distinction matters because it reframes the entire conversation away from emotion and toward structure. As men stepped away, many discovered that their internal landscape began to change in unexpected ways. Without constant pressure to perform or prove, their thoughts slowed down. Their nervous system stabilized. The background anxiety that once accompanied daily life began to fade. This created space for reflection. Men began to ask themselves questions they had postponed for years. What kind of life do I actually want? What does success mean to me when nobody else is defining it? What am I willing to trade my time and energy for? And what am I no longer willing to sacrifice myself to maintain? These questions do not produce instant answers, but they produce clarity over time. Clarity is transformative because it removes confusion. And confusion is often what traps people in unsatisfying cycles. With clarity comes responsibility, but this responsibility feels different than the burden men carried before. It is self directed rather than imposed. Men take ownership of their health, their finances, their routines, and their emotional regulation because doing so directly improves their quality of life. There is no illusion that someone else will rescue them or complete them. This self reliance is not rooted in isolation, but in realism. Men understand that while connection can enhance life, it cannot replace internal stability. That lesson, once learned, permanently alters how men approach relationships of every kind. As a result, men become less tolerant of ambiguity where it matters most. They value clear communication, clear boundaries, clear expectations. When clarity is absent, they disengage rather than argue. This is not avoidance, it is efficiency. Men no longer believe that endless discussion produces alignment when incentives are misaligned. They recognize that behavior reveals priorities more accurately than words. When behavior does not match stated intent, men adjust accordingly. This pattern recognition allows them to conserve energy and reduce emotional volatility. Over time, this creates a noticeable cultural shift. Men who once felt pressured to explain themselves now feel comfortable letting outcomes speak for them. They no longer feel obligated to justify their choices to people who do not share their values. This quiet confidence is often mistaken for indifference, but it is actually self trust. Men trust their judgment enough to accept disagreement without defensiveness. They do not need consensus to proceed. This independence from external validation is one of the most profound outcomes of walking away. Another important consequence is the restoration of dignity. Dignity is not about dominance or entitlement, it is about coherence between belief and action. Men regain dignity when they stop participating in arrangements that require them to betray their own interests or values. This does not make them rigid or uncompromising, it makes them principled. Principles provide a framework for decision making that reduces regret and resentment. Men who act in accordance with their principles may face short term discomfort, but they gain long term peace. This peace is often misunderstood because it does not look like constant excitement or stimulation. It looks like order, predictable routines, financial stability, physical well being, meaningful work, trusted friendships. These elements may not generate viral moments, but they sustain a life. Men who build their lives around these foundations are less susceptible to crisis because their identity is not tied to any single external factor. When something goes wrong, they adjust rather than collapse. As more men adopt this lifestyle, the broader social narrative begins to shift, even if slowly. The assumption that men will always fill certain roles by default loses accuracy. Participation becomes conditional rather than automatic. This forces a reckoning. Systems that once relied on unspoken sacrifice must either adapt or diminish. Adaptation requires acknowledging that men have agency and that agency cannot be ignored indefinitely. Respect becomes a prerequisite rather than an afterthought. For relationships specifically, this means a return to fundamentals: mutual benefit, mutual respect, shared responsibility, clear communication. These are not new ideas, but they become non negotiable when participation is optional. Men are no longer willing to enter relationships based on potential alone. They want observable alignment. This does not eliminate romance or connection, it grounds them in reality. Relationships built on reality are more resilient than those built on fantasy. It is also important to recognize that not all men will choose the same path. Walking away does not mean uniformity. Some men will remain open to partnership. Some will prioritize solitude. Some will move between these states at different stages of life. What unites them is not a single outcome, but a shared refusal to surrender agency. Men are choosing paths deliberately rather than drifting into roles out of expectation. As this becomes normalized, the conversation will gradually mature. It will move away from moral judgment and toward structural analysis. Why do certain dynamics discourage participation? What incentives produce sustainable engagement? How can systems be redesigned to reflect reality rather than ideology? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Avoiding them only prolongs misalignment. The reality is that men did not disappear. They redirected their energy. They invested it where it produced stability, growth, and peace. That investment paid off. Men discovered that a fulfilling life does not require constant validation or external approval. It requires alignment between values, actions, and environment. Once that alignment is achieved, it becomes the standard by which all future decisions are measured. This does not mean men are closed off or cynical. It means they are discerning. They understand that not every opportunity deserves their time. Not every relationship deserves their investment. Discernment is not rejection, it is selection. Selection based on lived experience rather than promises. This approach reduces disappointment and increases satisfaction over time. As the dust settles, one truth becomes unavoidable. Men walking away was never about escaping responsibility. It was about reclaiming it on their own terms. Responsibility chosen is empowering. Responsibility imposed is draining. Men have learned the difference, and they are acting accordingly. The future will not look like the past, but that does not mean it will be worse. It will be different. Different incentives, different expectations, different forms of connection. The men who have adapted are not waiting for permission. They are building lives that function regardless of whether old systems approve. That independence is the foundation upon which any healthy future relationship, community, or society must be built. And now, before we close this out, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with this perspective or do you see it differently? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts because this conversation matters and it is not going away. Like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.